Hey guys, tonight we're saddling up for something a little different. Not a shootout, not a gold rush, not even a dusty stagecoach chase. This time we're easing into the soft belly of a town where democracy wore muddy boots, and the ballot box sometimes smelled suspiciously like bacon grease. Welcome to Deadbell Gulch, a flickering little dot on the edge of the Nevada Territory in 1878. The kind of place where law was decided over poker hands and public office could be won with a round of drinks and a pie that didn't taste like shoe leather. The election was tomorrow, but the scandal, well, that had been simmering for weeks, boiling in tin coffee pots, whispered in barbershops, and sealed with spit-laced handshakes. You'll want to keep your boots on and your wits sharper than a barber's razor, because things in Deadbell didn't just get crooked, they came that way. Before we get too deep into the dust and dishonesty, go ahead and settle in. If you've been enjoying these slow rides through the past, it'd mean a lot if you gave that like button a gentle tap and maybe subscribed, but only if you truly want more of these soft, sleepy dives into forgotten history. And if you're listening somewhere far off, maybe in bed with the lights low and a fan humming quietly beside you, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing just how wide our little sleepy circle stretches across the world. Now, lower the lights, let the sounds of night ease in, and let's drift together into tonight's tale. It was the kind of town that didn't appear on every map, and maybe that was on purpose. Nestled in a crooked valley between two exhausted silver hills, Deadbell Gulch sat slumped like an old man who had once dreamed big but got tired somewhere along the way. The wooden buildings leaned a bit, as though too stubborn to fall over. The streets weren't paved with anything but regret and sun-baked dung, and the general store had a door that never quite closed unless you threatened it with a hammer. But it was home to just under 200 souls, miners, drifters, saloon keepers, a blacksmith who mostly cursed, and one sheriff who claimed to be the law but couldn't shoot straight unless he'd had exactly 2 swigs of rye and no more. And now, with an election coming, the whole town had the itch. Not the good kind that comes from fresh laundry or new boots, but the uneasy kind, the kind that prickled behind your knees when someone offered you a smile that didn't reach their eyes. Sheriff Amos Pickett was up for re-election, and no one was quite sure whether he'd earn it or buy it. Rumours said he had struck a deal with Miss Lorna over at the Velvet Lily Saloon. Free drinks for voters wearing his ribbon, or maybe just a wink and a pinch for the undecided ones. There was even talk that the local undertaker, old Jasper Wynne, had registered 2 of his more recent clients to vote by proxy. He claimed it was legal. They'd voted last time after all, so there it was, a town baked dry by sun and swollen with secrets, where the chickens pecked at campaign flyers and the preacher prayed a little too loudly for honest outcomes, while taking quiet sips from a brown bottle. Deadbell Gulch wasn't ready for what was coming, but the election would happen all the same, with or without honesty, and you, dear listener, are about to be part of it. The sun came up slow the next morning, crawling its way across the slanted roofs of Deadbell Gulch like it wasn't sure it wanted to be involved in what the day had planned. It brought no coolness, just a pale gold glare that made the windows squint and turned the dust in the street into dancing ghosts. Chickens clucked near the well. Horses swatted flies in their sleep. And in the middle of town, a battered sign swayed gently in front of the town hall, its faded paint declaring, "Election today. Vote honest." It had been hammered up by the schoolteacher, Miss Eliza, whose optimism had outlived 3 schoolhouses and 2 husbands, but even she winced when she passed it now. No one in Deadbell believed in honest voting anymore, not since the last election, when 2 drunks and a mule named Percival cast ballots for sheriff. This year there were 3 candidates. Sheriff Amos Pickett, who had worn the badge for 4 years without ever remembering where he left his revolver, was the favourite in the kind of way mould is a favourite in old bread. He wasn't liked so much as tolerated. His main strength was that no one wanted to go through the trouble of replacing him. He had the backing of the saloon, the gambling hall, and most of the folks who preferred a lawman that looked the other way when a poker game ran late, or a horse went missing but eventually came back with a new brand. Then there was Horace Featherling, a former travelling pharmacist who had arrived in town 6 months ago selling elixirs made of snake oil, vinegar, and raw determination. Somehow he'd convinced a few ranchers he was a man of vision, which really just meant he'd bought everyone a drink the night before he announced his candidacy. He promised clean water, paved roads, and better manners at town meetings, all of which made him sound suspiciously like he didn't belong. And lastly, there was Miss Adeline Crowe, owner of the post office and purveyor of some of the town's juiciest gossip folded neatly into letters she sometimes delayed for dramatic effect. Adeline wasn't officially running, but her name had been written in so many times last election that she'd taken to wearing a red ribbon and saying things like, "If elected, I will absolutely not serve," which of course made people want to vote for her even more. Her campaign slogan, painted by her niece on a piece of linen hanging from the post office porch, simply read, "I won't lie to you, but I might withhold the truth." It was the most honest sentence anyone had heard in town in years. The polling station was set up inside the town's former church, now used for public gatherings and the occasional wedding if the couple didn't mind the faint smell of mildew and last year's cider explosion. A long table had been set up near the pulpit with a cracked ceramic bowl of pencils, some hand-folded ballots, and a ledger thicker than most folks' moral compass. Behind the table sat old Thaddeus Grint, who had been the election clerk for the past 20 years, mostly because no one else wanted the job. His glasses were always fogged, his hearing questionable, and his method of recording votes depended on how many cups of coffee he'd had that morning. Next to him was young Mary Ellen, the school teacher's niece who believed in fairness and had brought her own ink bottle and a strict glare for anyone she suspected might try something shady, which in Deadbell was everyone. By 10 in the morning, the line to vote was longer than expected, mostly because folks were curious to see if the rumours were true about Jasper Wynn's clients casting their ballots. Sure enough, 2 wheelbarrows rolled up just before lunch, each carrying a pine box with a small hat resting neatly on top. Jasper, wearing his cleanest black vest and a deeply serious expression, presented papers claiming the deceased had registered in life and therefore had the right to be counted in death. Sheriff Pickett stood nearby, scratching his beard with one hand and sipping weak coffee with the other, and said nothing. When Mary Ellen protested, Jasper pulled a folded note from his pocket, signed by Judge Ernest Broom, who had a mysterious tendency to sign anything before noon if it came with cinnamon bread and a small bribe of tobacco. The coffins were eventually placed in the corner of the hall like extra chairs, and by midday, 2 ghostly votes had been logged without a whisper of scandal from Thaddeus, who just nodded and said, "Regulars." Meanwhile, Horace Featherling tried handing out free tonic to waiting voters, which resulted in 3 people vomiting near the church steps, and 1 elderly man claiming to see a vision of a better sheriff in the clouds. Miss Adeline, ever the realist, stood on the post office porch sipping lemonade and making sarcastic observations loud enough for everyone to hear. She said if the election came down to who lied less, she'd win by default, since her only sin was strategic silence. As the afternoon stretched long and hot, the town's air filled with tension and the scent of roasting beans from the cafe. Horses paced nervously, and dogs barked at shadows. The mood was calm in the way that water seems calm before a flash flood. Something was brewing beneath all the laughter and small talk, something that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with pride, memory, and unfinished business. The sun had shifted westward by the time most of the votes were cast, and with every hour that ticked away, Deadbell Gulch grew heavier with that particular kind of silence that only comes when people are pretending they're not waiting. Inside the saloon, folks had gathered with the unspoken agreement that the real results would be decided there, not in the old church hall. The Velvet Lily, draped in faded red curtains and filled with the scent of spilled whiskey and wood smoke, had always been more than just a place to drink. It was where deals were struck, arguments forgotten, and sometimes promises made that never survived the morning. Sheriff Pickett sat at his usual table in the far corner, nursing a drink that looked more like river water than rye. He wasn't smiling, but then again, he rarely did, unless it was just before arresting someone he didn't like. His boots were kicked out beneath him, hat pulled low, and his badge glinted just enough in the lamplight to remind folks whose name they'd circled on their ballot. Miss Lorna, the saloon's proprietress and self-appointed queen of the local gossip circuit, made her rounds like a preacher on Sunday, except her sermon came in the form of flirtations, favours, and little glass cups that made folks more agreeable. It was said she'd memorised every secret in town, and if she didn't know something, she made it up so convincingly that truth bowed out just to avoid the competition. She'd taken a particular interest in the election, mainly because it gave her the chance to expand her influence. Over the past week, she had offered free drinks for anyone showing up with a picket ribbon, and a curious amount of people had discovered they liked the taste of civic loyalty when it came with gin and card games. Lorna didn't care who won, not really. What she wanted was predictability, and Sheriff Pickett, for all his flaws and occasional forgetfulness, had never once interfered with her business. That counted for a lot in a town where moral judgment was considered the leading cause of broken windows. On the other side of the saloon, Horace Featherling stood by the piano, trying to give a speech no one had asked for. His tonic had lost its appeal after that unfortunate bout of mass nausea, and now he was pivoting to ideals and slogans. "A new wind is blowing through Deadbell," he declared to a table of miners more interested in their cards than his platform. "And that wind smells like progress." One of them grunted without looking up and muttered, "Smells like your tonic." The laughter that followed was light, not cruel, but enough to wilt Horace's posture by an inch. Still, he wasn't ready to quit. He had spent the last of his earnings printing leaflets on borrowed paper, each one promising road improvements, school repairs, and something vague about a community vegetable garden. In any other town, he might have been laughed out completely. But Deadbell wasn't so much a town as a collection of tired hopes tied together by habit, and that meant even Horace had a chance. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift toward evening, that gentle purple hour when shadows stretched long, and everything took on a kind of sleepy haze. Children ran between buildings, kicking up dust and shouting, unaware of the adult world teetering on the edge of petty politics. Over by the general store, a group of old-timers had formed a half-circle near a barrel fire, discussing the election in the low tones of men who had seen too many campaigns end in fistfights and apologies made over broken teeth. They agreed on one thing. Something about this election felt off. Not just the usual bribes and whisper deals, but something deeper, quieter. There had been sightings of strangers, men who didn't belong, hanging around the telegraph office and asking questions they had no business asking. One had tried to buy a stack of ballots, not knowing Thaddeus kept them under his dinner plate until the polls opened. Another had been spotted speaking to the judge, passing him what looked suspiciously like a velvet pouch that clinked when it moved. Whispers like those had a way of weaving through a town like Deadbell, catching on loose windows and open doors, sliding under floorboards and riding the breeze through broken roof slats. People didn't say things outright, but they shifted their chairs closer, lowered their voices, and made eye contact that lingered just a little longer than it used to. Even Miss Adeline, who rarely left the post office during daylight, was seen walking purposefully toward the church hall, lips pressed tight, her ribbon pinned with more force than fashion. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than Horace ever could in 10 sermons. By sundown, the sky burned with streaks of orange and crimson, as if the horizon itself was quietly warning the town to brace for something they couldn't quite name. In the saloon, the piano was quiet, the laughter had dulled, and glasses sat half full on warped tables. It wasn't just the waiting, it was the sense that everyone in Deadbell had cast a vote, and now they weren't sure if they had chosen the lesser evil or simply the more familiar one. Sheriff Pickett stood at last, adjusted his belt with the slow certainty of a man who believed the job was his by default, and walked out without saying a word. The door swung closed behind him with a creak that echoed longer than it should have. Up the hill, the church bell gave a single lopsided ring. Not loud, just enough to say the count had begun. Evening slipped fully into night, and Deadbell Gulch held its breath. There was no announcement, no trumpet of results, just that half-hearted clang of the church bell and the slow creak of footsteps over warped floorboards inside the old chapel. It had once held sermons and baptisms, and now it held the town's fragile faith in fairness, which wasn't saying much. The chapel's interior glowed faintly with candlelight flickering, shadows against peeling walls and the cracked faces of painted saints whose halos had faded with the years. The voting table had been moved aside to make room for the counting. 3 boxes sat at the front, one for each candidate, though Miss Adeline's box had been fashioned out of a biscuit tin due to the shortage of wood and the abundance of ironic humour. Thaddeus Grint, still hunched over like a rusted hinge, pulled votes from each box slowly, one at a time, his spectacles catching the candlelight and making his eyes appear permanently surprised. He read each name aloud, voice dry as old corn husks, while Mary Ellen marked tallies beside him with careful hands and the nervous energy of someone trying to fix a broken system with good intentions alone. Every now and then she'd pause and glance sideways at the open windows, where faces hovered just out of sight, townsfolk too curious to leave but too sceptical to step inside. The tension dripped down the walls like humidity, soaking into the floorboards. Outside, the breeze had gone still, and the usual chorus of crickets had fallen oddly silent, as if even nature knew this count carried more than just names. The town square was dimly lit by lanterns hanging from porches, their glow pooling weakly on the dirt road, casting long stretched shadows that touched and pulled apart like they didn't want to be near each other. Folks had gathered quietly in clusters, hands in pockets, hats low, murmuring about what they'd seen that day and what they expected to hear tonight. There was no shouting, no cheers, only the hushed tones of people who had spent years pretending nothing ever changed, and who now weren't quite sure what to hope for. Sheriff Pickett stood alone near the hitching post, arms folded, face unreadable. He'd spent enough years in Deadbell to know when a storm was coming, and though there wasn't a cloud in the sky, his bones said something was off. Not wrong necessarily, just sideways. Like a poker game with too many folded cards and not enough players still at the table. He knew about the whispers, the strangers, the vote-buying accusations. He'd seen the bribes handed off in daylight, too brazen to bother with backroom corners. But Deadbell had always been a place where truth came last, after convenience, after gossip, and far after someone's version of loyalty. Pickett didn't need to win to keep order. He needed to win to keep his deal with Miss Lorna, with the judge, with half the shopkeepers who'd come to rely on his indifference like a warm coat. Inside the chapel, Mary Ellen's chalk tapped harder against the slate as the tallies climbed. Pickett was leading, but not by much. Featherling, to everyone's shock, had gathered a respectable number of votes, likely from those who'd bought his tonic and survived. And then there was Miss Adeline, whose biscuit tin kept yielding folded slips like a magician's hat. No one quite knew who was writing her name, but it was happening with unsettling consistency. Thaddeus didn't question it. He read each one with the same dry tone and kept count. Mary Ellen, however, was biting her lower lip by then, her eyes darting between the tin and the town ledger, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing its pieces. Around the time the lanterns were beginning to sputter outside, there came a murmur that rippled through the crowd like a thrown stone in still water. Jasper Wynne, the undertaker, had returned to the square, wheeling his cart slowly, this time with only one box. He claimed it had been left behind in his rush that morning, and that the voter inside was very much entitled to representation. The crowd didn't laugh this time. A few people stepped back. Others just looked at each other and shrugged, because really, what was one more dead man voting in a town where half the living were already ghosts? Mary Ellen refused to accept the box, standing stiff as a fence post, arms crossed and eyes blazing. But Thaddeus eventually overruled her with a wheeze and a shrug. He did vote last year, he muttered, which seemed to be his standard for most legal decisions. So the box joined the others, and the count went on. By the time they reached the final handful of ballots, the chapel was quiet as a grave. Pickett and Featherling were neck and neck, and Miss Adeline's count was just behind, a whisper away from surprising everyone, including herself. Mary Ellen held the last slip in her hand, fingertips smudged with chalk and sweat, and stared at it like it was a rattlesnake in disguise. She didn't read it aloud at first. She just looked at Thaddeus, then at the boxes, then at the open chapel door where Sheriff Pickett stood now, watching. Only then did she unfold the vote, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had something to lose from what was written inside. Her mouth moved around the name, silent at first, then softly, Adeline Crow. And that was it. A tie. The town didn't cheer. No one slapped backs or raised glasses. They just stood there, suspended in that strange space between outcome and action, where people wait for someone else to speak first so they can decide how they feel. And Sheriff Pickett, still standing in the doorway, didn't move. He didn't nod, didn't frown, just stared as though the night itself had tricked him. Behind him, down the street, a single dog barked once, then fell quiet again. The moment hung in the chapel like heavy smoke curling between rafters and settling on the shoulders of everyone inside. A tie was the one thing nobody in Deadbell Gulch had prepared for, not even Miss Adeline herself. She blinked slowly at the news, her lips parted just enough to betray the smallest twitch of disbelief, but she said nothing. Her hands, always busy folding letters or rearranging her brooch, were still. The paper tally board trembled faintly in Mary Ellen's grip, the final line of chalk stopping, mid-stroke, as though her arm had forgotten what it was doing. Thaddeus leaned back with a soft groan, creaking like old barnwood, and squinted again at the numbers, as if they might change if he looked just the right way. They didn't. Outside, the crowd hadn't moved much either. The word had spread from the church steps with a speed that made you wonder how quickly they could have built the railroad if they'd put that kind of energy into steel and not gossip. The square was thick with quiet mutters and low whistles, the kind of unsettled noise that comes when people realise they are not quite part of history, but rather trapped inside one of its more confusing footnotes. Sheriff Pickett remained near the entrance, his face unreadable in the glow of lanterns, one hand resting on his belt where his badge glinted faintly, the other hand curled into a slow tap against his leg. A tie. Not a loss, but certainly not a win. By Deadbell's rules, which had never been written down anywhere more official than the back of a whiskey-stained menu at the Velvet Lily, a tie could be settled one of two ways. Either the candidates agreed to a runoff vote the following week, which meant another 7 days of mudslinging and half-price liquor, or they left it up to the town council to make a final decision. The problem was, Deadbell hadn't technically had a full council in nearly 3 years. One had died in a chicken-related accident, another left to join a gold-digging commune in Oregon, and the third, old Lester Mott, hadn't left his root cellar since the incident with the beekeeping ordinance. That left only Judge Broom, and most folks trusted him less than they trusted raw milk in summer. Inside the chapel, Mary Ellen finally cleared her throat, the sound dry and thin, but it broke the silence like a twig snapping underfoot. She spoke with the careful cadence of someone translating a law they didn't agree with. "It's a tie," she said again, this time louder, her eyes scanning the faces watching her from the windows and the benches. "According to town precedent, we have to refer to Judge Broom for resolution." A groan rippled through the room. One man muttered something about arm wrestling being more honest. Someone else whispered, "We could just let the loon vote again." But the room knew, deep down, that the wheels had already turned in a direction no one could stop. Miss Adeline rose from her seat near the back, smoothing her skirt with slow, deliberate hands, then walked forward with the kind of quiet dignity that didn't demand attention, but always received it. She didn't speak to Mary Ellen or Thaddeus. Instead, she stopped beside the biscuit tin that had held her votes and stared at it as though it were a wounded animal. For a moment, it looked like she might walk away, might let the whole thing slide back into the realm of Deadbell's dusty almosts. But then she turned toward Sheriff Pickett, her voice calm, not sharp, not theatrical, just steady, like the ticking of a well-made clock. "We'll go to the judge," she said. "If nothing else, it'll be worth watching." Pickett didn't answer right away, his jaw tensed slightly, and something flickered behind his eyes. a kind of calculation that had nothing to do with fairness. He knew Broom, everyone did, and though the judge was as slippery as a buttered eel, he was also a man who liked things quiet, predictable, and properly oiled with favours. That made him a likely ally for Pickett, assuming no one else had reached him first. Still, Pickett tipped his hat to Adeline in a gesture that carried more habit than meaning. "Fair enough," he said softly. Then he turned and walked into the night, his boots crunching against the gravel as the doors swung shut behind him. The crowd began to drift after that, breaking apart like a flock of birds scattered by a sudden gust. No one wanted to say much. They just looked at each other with tired eyes, half amused and half afraid, and wandered off toward home, lanterns in hand and minds full of questions. In a town where nobody really believed in miracles, they weren't quite sure what to make of a deadlocked election. Some called it a sign, others has called it a delay in the inevitable, most just called it typical. Back inside the chapel, Mary Ellen stayed behind to erase the tally marks, her sleeve dragging softly over the slate. She didn't look up when Adeline passed by her, and Adeline, for her part, said nothing as she stepped back into the cool night, where the stars blinked down with the kind of disinterest only the sky can afford. She walked past the general store, past the empty hitching post, past the shuttered bank that hadn't opened in weeks. When she reached the post office, she stopped and looked up at the sign above the door. It creaked faintly in the breeze. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. Then she went inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote howled. Far off, a door slammed. And just like that, Deadbell settled into its uncertain night, resting on the edge of an answer that no one trusted, and everyone already suspected. Morning in Deadbell Gulch arrived, slow and indifferent. The kind of grey that slipped in through cracks and crept under doorframes without ever fully announcing itself. It was the sort of day that didn't try to impress anyone. The sun stayed tucked behind a pale sky, offering just enough light to see your way through the dust, but not enough to warm the skin or cheer the bones. The town, still half asleep from the night before, stirred quietly. Doors creaked open, boots shuffled along wooden porches, coffee boiled over campfires and stovetops alike. No one shouted, no one laughed. Even the dogs barked with less enthusiasm. Word had spread before sunrise that the tie-breaking decision would fall into the lap of Judge Broom by noon, and so the entire town found itself walking through the morning as though it were crossing thin ice. Judge Ernest Broom lived at the edge of town in a squat house that leaned slightly to the left, as if even its foundation wasn't fully convinced of its integrity. The curtains were always drawn, the gate always crooked. A faded placard near the door still read Broom Notary and Lawman, though most folks just called him that man with the ledger. It was said he had once studied law in St. Louis, though others claimed he'd merely bought the books and taught himself the parts that seemed useful. He kept a journal filled with names, favours, grudges, and IOUs, all in tiny handwriting that no one else could decipher, and believed the ledger held more power than any badge or ballot, because Judge Broom never forgot a deal. He might forgive it if it suited him, but he never forgot. By mid-morning, the town had begun to orbit the courthouse in a loose, anxious loop. People lingered on benches, leaned against doorframes, cleaned their spectacles unnecessarily. Miss Lorna, dressed in her second-best shawl and holding a tin of shortbread cookies meant for influencing the judge's sweet tooth, arrived early and waited near the courthouse steps, pretending not to pace. Horace Featherling, visibly deflated but still clinging to a pamphlet he no longer distributed, muttered about legal appeals to anyone who would listen, which at this point was mostly himself. Miss Adeline, calm as ever, sat on the bench near the livery stable with her hands folded over her lap, her face unusual, her ribbon pinned straight and neat. She had brought no cookies, no campaign flyers, no supporters, just herself and a pair of clean gloves, which she held gently like a folded letter not yet opened. Sheriff Pickett was the last to arrive. He came not on horseback, but walking, slow and heavy-heeled, as though each step weighed more than the last. His hat was pulled low, and he greeted no one, not even Thaddeus, who offered a hopeful nod in passing. Pickett didn't need a crowd. He had history, he had patience, and more than anything, he had an understanding of how Judge Broom thought. They had done business before, quiet business, the sort that never left paper trails but always left impressions. Pickett didn't carry a ledger, but he understood the weight of one. He understood the exchange of small debts, favours paid not in gold or silver, but in silence and convenience. He believed truly and deeply that this decision was already made. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat behind a desk that was older than the town itself, its surface worn smooth by years of elbows and signatures and slow decisions. The room was small, just 4 pews along each side, and a rusted iron stove in the corner that hadn't worked properly since the blizzard of '72. The only window had been nailed half shut with a board that someone meant to fix but never did. There were no flags, no portraits, no illusion of grandeur. Just a man, his books, and his memory. Judge Broom was not an expressive man. His face was permanently set to the same dull expression he wore while eating soup or settling land disputes. He was tall but slightly stooped. His suit always one button off, his collar never quite straight. He didn't command attention so much as he absorbed it. When he entered a room, people lowered their voices, not out of fear, but out of respect for how much he knew and how little he said. Today, he held the ledger on his lap, one finger wedged between pages, and he read slowly as the candidates stepped inside. He did not greet them. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply lifted his gaze and waited for them to speak. Miss Adeline stood first, hand steady, voice calm, and said only that she trusted the town's will, but that she believed justice required clarity. Pickett spoke next, his voice lower, flatter, a tone that hinted at fatigue rather than arrogance. He reminded the judge that he had kept order, kept peace, and let the town run without trouble. He did not mention favours, he didn't need to. The judge listened, nodded once, then opened his ledger, and read for nearly 5 minutes in silence. No one interrupted. He flipped a page, tapped the binding once, and finally closed the book with a soft thud that echoed across the worn floorboards. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting Adeline's first, then Pickett's. He said only 5 words. "There'll be a runoff vote." Gasps flickered through the doorway. Adeline's brow lifted just slightly, not in shock, but recognition. Pickett frowned, just for a second, his jaw tightening, and the judge, without further comment, stood, tucked the ledger beneath his arm, and left the room through the back door, as if he had somewhere far less complicated to be. Deadbell didn't cheer, it simply adjusted. The runoff would be held in 3 days, just enough time for more scheming, more whispering, and maybe a few more biscuit tins full of names. But for now, the town exhaled slowly, like a man loosening his belt after a long, tense meal. 3 days. That was the space Deadbell Gulch had been given. 72 hours to reckon with itself. Not enough time to forget the trouble and just enough to stir it deeper. The runoff vote was set for Saturday, and by the time word had trickled through town, a strange sort of energy took hold. Not exactly excitement, not quite dread. It was more like the feeling you get when you see storm clouds on the horizon, but the air is too still, too warm, and you just know that whatever's coming won't pass gently. Sheriff Pickett went quiet after the judge's announcement. He returned to his office, didn't hold court at the saloon like usual, didn't make his usual rounds, didn't show his face at the general store or the post office. Some thought he was sulking, others assumed he was planning, and those who knew him well enough suspected it was a bit of both. The sheriff wasn't the sort to campaign with speeches or favours. His strategy had always been a combination of fatigue and familiarity. Most people voted for him because they knew what he was, and feared what they didn't. He leaned on routine, on the idea that it was better to keep the wheel turning crooked than risk it spinning wild. But now that routine had been cracked open, the tie had exposed something soft beneath the dust, and Pickett knew that. He spent the first day pacing the narrow confines of his office, running his finger along the barrel of his revolver, not because he intended to use it, but because it helped him think. The town had spoken, and the sound it made was split clean down the middle. That meant there were eyes watching him that hadn't watched before, doubts that hadn't existed yesterday. That kind of thing didn't go away easy, especially not in Deadbell, where change clung like humidity and suspicion ripened quick. Miss Adeline, meanwhile, continued her days with the same quiet rhythm she always had. She opened the post office promptly at 8, dusted the counter, sorted the incoming letters by hand. If anyone looked closely, they'd notice she walked with her chin a little higher, her steps a touch more deliberate, but otherwise she gave no sign of basking in her new political relevance. Folks came by, mostly under the guise of checking for mail that never arrived, and left having said too much or too little. Adeline never gave much away. She answered questions with more questions, smiled without promise, and let the silence do most of the work. She didn't need campaign posters. Her best weapon was curiosity. The town wanted to know what it would be like if she won, and the not knowing did more work than any speech ever could. By the Sunday, new rumours had begun to sprout like mushrooms after rain. Someone claimed they'd seen Miss Lorna in deep conversation with a stranger who might have been a lawyer or might have been a travelling preacher. Either way, he left town with a letter sealed in wax and a tip of the hat to no one in particular. Others whispered that Horace Featherling had been trying to sell his remaining tonic in bulk to the blacksmith, insisting it could be used to clean rust from nails. His campaign, such as it had been, had withered completely, but he stayed in town lingering near the saloon, hoping someone would ask him for advice or maybe just buy him a drink. The real trouble, though, began late on that second night, when someone broke into the back window of the post office. They didn't steal anything, at least nothing that could be proven. No cash, no parcels, not even the sweet biscuits Miss Adeline kept in a tin behind the counter. But a stack of voting forms, already prepared for Saturday, was found scattered across the floor, a few torn, some partially scribbled on. When Adeline discovered the mess just before dawn, she said nothing. She simply picked up the slips one by one and laid them flat on the counter. She re-inked the pens. She set a new lock on the door. Then she brewed a pot of strong coffee and waited for the town to wake up and discover what had happened. Word travelled quickly. By mid-morning, everyone knew about the break-in. No one accused anyone out loud, but eyes drifted toward the sheriff's office, then toward Adeline's porch, then back to each other. It didn't take much to divide a town like Deadbell. Just a few words left unclaimed, just a boot print in the wrong place or a door left swinging on its hinges. The third day arrived brittle with tension. The temperature rose quickly, and the breeze turned hot and strange. The judge made no further comment. The saloon offered discounts to anyone who vowed to vote with sense. The barber took down his re-elect picket sign and replaced it with a chalkboard that read, "Still taking bets." Adeline did not close the post office early, though a few suggested she ought to. Instead, she spent the day writing letters. Not real ones, perhaps. No one could say, but she folded them with care, sealed them with wax, and placed them in the outgoing slot. And when dusk came soft and slow, she stood at her porch, hands behind her back, and looked out at the town with a calm so absolute it unnerved more than a few passers-by. In Deadbell Gulch, the wind didn't carry secrets so much as it stirred them, like sediment at the bottom of a well. And now the well was cloudy. Tomorrow they'd vote again. And whatever rose to the top, it wouldn't come clean. Saturday dawned with a strange hush, as if the whole of Deadbell Gulch had agreed to speak in whispers. The sky was streaked in muted pink and blue, not the kind of bright, boastful sunrise that usually painted the hills, but something quieter, more hesitant, as though nature itself had paused to see what the day would bring. Even the roosters seemed to crow with less confidence. Doors opened with creaks that felt louder than usual. Footsteps padded across dirt streets that had grown extra dry overnight. And eyes met eyes in 1,000 quick glances as the townspeople stepped into the daylight. The polling station had been moved from the chapel to the old schoolhouse, perhaps out of superstition, or perhaps because no one trusted the place after that peculiar tie. The schoolhouse still smelled faintly of ink and chalk and damp wood, and someone had hung a fresh sprig of sage above the doorway, a little charm against misfortune that had been used in Deadbell since before anyone could remember. Mary Ellen was there again, earlier than anyone, sleeves rolled and jaw set, determined to keep order if it killed her. Thaddeus Grint had been gently excused from the proceedings, which was the polite way of saying that several townsfolk had suggested he take a few days' rest before he counted himself into another scandal. In his place sat Mr. Banning, the banker's nephew, young and upright and very eager to be helpful, which made some folks more nervous than Thaddeus ever had. By 9 o'clock the line to vote stretched down the block, but the atmosphere was nothing like the usual election day excitement. There were no campaign songs, no shouted endorsements, no children running between grown-up legs pretending to cast imaginary votes. Instead, people waited in stiff silence, hats in hands, mouths pressed shut. They voted quickly, quietly, heads down, as though embarrassed to be part of it. No one smiled, no one lingered. They marked their choices and left like it was something shameful, a chore best completed in solitude. Miss Adeline arrived late in the morning, walking alone, gloved hands, holding a folded umbrella against the sun. She gave no speech, made no show, just nodded once at Mary Ellen, cast her vote, and left without pause. Sheriff Pickett arrived an hour later, mounted on his bay gelding, wearing his cleanest shirt and a holster polished to a shine. He dismounted with the calm of a man who expected the outcome but didn't particularly enjoy the waiting. He said nothing as he stepped into the schoolhouse, but he nodded to Mr. Banning with the faintest curl of a smile, the kind that might have meant confidence or menace depending on who you asked. When he emerged, a few townsfolk offered quiet greetings, which he acknowledged with a tip of the hat, but the warmth was gone. That easy familiarity he once traded on like spare change had grown thin, and people were starting to count their steps around him. The vote continued through the afternoon. By the time the last ballot was cast, the heat had pressed itself down on the town like a wool blanket, heavy and unrelenting. Even the shadows seemed tired. Mary Ellen locked the doors promptly at 4, posted the close sign in the window, and began the count under the careful eye of Mr. Banning and 2 appointed witnesses, one from each candidate's camp. The schoolhouse windows remained shut, curtains drawn, the thick air inside buzzing with the tension of dry mouths and twitching hands. Outside, folks gathered again in small clusters, not because they expected anything to change in those few hours, but because it felt wrong to go home and so much hung in the balance. The saloon stayed unusually quiet. Miss Lorna refused to host any celebration until results were announced. Even the piano had been closed, its lid dusted but silent. The blacksmith stood in front of his shop, arms crossed, staring down the road toward the schoolhouse as though it owed him an answer. At the general store, Miss Eliza prepared a tray of lemonade and biscuits that no one came to take. Judge Broom was nowhere to be seen, and the absence made people even more uneasy. When the most informed man in town stayed indoors on a day like this, folks began to imagine he knew something they didn't. Inside the schoolhouse, the last vote was tallied just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Mary Ellen, pale with exhaustion and blotches of chalk on her skirt, straightened her back and looked toward Mr. Banning, who sat with a pencil hovering above the final count. There were no gasps this time, no dramatic moments, just a number, read aloud in a voice that trembled slightly, despite every effort to remain firm. 58 votes for Miss Adeline Crowe, 54 for Sheriff Amos Pickett, 4 votes short, but a win nonetheless. There was no cheer, no applause, just the sound of someone outside dropping a tin cup and cursing softly. And then, silence again, deep and uncertain, the kind that hangs between 2 thoughts too big to finish. Adeline didn't react when the word reached her porch. She simply stepped inside, removed her gloves, and placed her umbrella in the stand like she'd come in from a passing shower. Pickett didn't storm or protest. He walked back to his office, leaned against the wall for a long while, and finally sat down without taking off his hat. The sun had set by then, and the town of Deadbell glowed faintly under the weight of lantern light and fresh consequence. Tomorrow there would be questions. There would be shifts and reckonings, and old promises re-examined under new eyes. But tonight there was just the gentle creak of porch boards, the distant crackle of oil lamps, and the strange, still quiet of a town that had voted, and for once gotten something it didn't quite expect. Sunday morning came not with a fanfare or even a rustle of change, but with a soft, tired stillness. It was the kind of silence that seeps deep into floorboards and coffee cups and the backs of people's throats. Deadbell Gulch did not wake with any great commotion. There was no church bell, no preacher's cry, no rallying calls from the winning side. In fact, it seemed as though most folks hadn't yet decided what it meant. This new shift, this strange new chapter that had begun without even asking if they were ready to turn the page. A few came out early to sweep their porches or collect water from the well, but they moved slower than usual, watching each other like the air itself was waiting for someone to go first. Miss Adeline did not open the post office that morning. That alone set off a ripple of unease through the town. She had not missed a morning in over a decade, not through sickness or snow, or even during that fire scare back in '73. People passed by the porch, paused, glanced up at the drawn curtains, and said nothing. The sign on the door still read "Open 8 to 3 except Sundays," but the absence of her presence behind the counter made the whole front of the building feel hollow, as if the post office were nothing more than a shell waiting to be filled again. Some wondered if she had left. Others guessed she was simply resting. Most understood, without needing to say it, that she was thinking. Not about the win — Adeline didn't strike anyone as the celebrating type — but about the weight of what would come next. Sheriff Pickett did not show his face either. His office remained shuttered, though the lamp inside glowed faintly against the grime-slicked window. A few folks gathered near the front steps, not close enough to knock, but close enough to trade low murmurs about what he might do. No one feared violence. Pickett was too tired for that now, too worn down by years of sidestepping justice and calling it peace. But there was a restlessness in his silence. Not rage, but something worse. The heavy acknowledgement that the world he'd managed to hold in place with habit and neglect had finally shifted beneath his boots. A win would have allowed him to drift on. A tie had rattled him. A loss made things permanent in a way that no man in Deadbell ever liked to face. At the Velvet Lily, Miss Lorna poured coffee instead of whiskey, her hair pinned tighter than usual and her voice softer. She spoke less, listened more, and wore that inscrutable smile that meant she was already adjusting to the new balance. She had survived 4 mayors, 2 fires, and a brief and utterly disastrous attempt at prohibition. It would survive Adeline too, and perhaps even thrive under her, provided she could find the rhythm quickly enough. Still, she watched the door more than usual, expecting someone or something, trouble maybe, or an apology, or perhaps a favour in a new voice. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Miss Adeline finally stepped outside. She wore the same dark dress she'd worn to cast her vote the day before, but the gloves were gone, and the ribbon had been replaced by a small silver pin shaped like a quill. She did not speak to anyone at first. She merely walked, slowly along the edge of the square, past the barber shop where someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers in an old whiskey bottle, past the general store where Miss Eliza gave her a quiet nod but didn't say a word, past the saloon where Miss Lorna tipped her head in what might have been respect or curiosity or simply acknowledgement. Adeline's face was calm, thoughtful. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. When she reached the courthouse steps, she paused. It was not her office yet, not officially, but the key would be handed over in the morning, and everyone knew the town had already begun treating her as the voice to listen to. She didn't climb the steps, she didn't make a speech. She simply stood there for a while, arms folded, eyes sweeping across the square, and for the first time in a long time Deadbell stood still with her, as if waiting to be told what it was now. A small boy with a slingshot wandered past, kicking a pebble. An old woman across the street muttered that maybe now someone would finally fix the road to the mill. A dog barked once from behind the livery stable, but otherwise no one moved. And when Adeline turned and walked back the way she came, something in the air felt different. Not better, not worse, just different. Like the town had shifted slightly on its foundations and was waiting to see if the new angle would hold. Later that evening, Sheriff Pickett emerged. He didn't make a show of it. He just walked across the square with the same slow, heavy gait he always had. His badge was gone, left behind on the desk where he'd once hung his coat. He carried no weapons, wore no uniform, just a man now, out of office, out of time. He passed Adeline on her porch, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then Pickett nodded once, a small, weary gesture, and Adeline returned it, just as small, just as weary. No words exchanged, but everything said. The sun dipped low again, casting the town in amber and ash, the sky painted in long fading streaks. Inside their homes, folks lit lanterns and stoked their stoves. The dust of the election began to settle, though not all the questions had. Not by a long shot, but Deadbell Gulch had taken a step it couldn't take back. And for the first time in a long while, it wasn't entirely sure where that step would lead. Monday came dressed in wind. Not the cool brushing breeze that danced over hills in spring, but a dry, talkative wind that whipped through Deadbell Gulch with the urgency of someone who had too much to say and not enough time to say it. It rattled loose shutters and shook tired window panes, carrying dust down alleys and into front parlours, as if the town itself were being reminded not to grow too comfortable. With the new mayor not yet sworn in and the sheriff freshly unseated, Deadbell walked into the week without a hand on the reins. And that was a dangerous thing in a place where memory ran deep and patience ran shallow. Judge Broom arrived at the courthouse just after sunrise, a wool scarf wrapped around his thin neck, ledger in one hand, black coffee in the other. He didn't speak to the gathering cluster of townsfolk who watched him mount the steps. He barely acknowledged them. He just moved with the same quiet precision he always had, the sort of routine that neither victory nor disaster could shake. Inside, he unlocked the front door, set down the coffee and opened the ledger to a blank page. Today's page. A new chapter. He wasn't thrilled about it, but he respected order, and the town had chosen. He would honour that choice, provided it didn't mess too deeply with the order of his columns. Down the road, the Velvet Lily was sweeping out the residue of the weekend. Miss Lorna, never one to let dust settle twice in the same place, moved through her establishment like a tide. She righted chairs, wiped tables, and reorganised the bottle display twice before deciding it was best left the way it was. The results of the run-off had shifted something in her, though she wouldn't admit it out loud. She'd spent years building quiet alliances with men who liked to keep things how they'd always been. But the tide had turned in favour of a woman who didn't deal into comfort or flattery. Miss Adeline didn't owe the saloon a thing, and that meant Lorna needed to find new footing, which she would. She always did. But for now, she watched and waited, listening more than speaking, feeling the tremble of things rearranging beneath her heels. Miss Adeline, for her part, prepared for the morning with the same sense of ritual she brought to every part of her life. She brewed her tea, cleaned her small stovetop with a cloth she'd embroidered herself and dressed with deliberate care. Her hair was pinned just so, her pin of the quill fastened over her collar, and in her hand she carried a small worn notebook, not a ledger like Broom's, but close in size and perhaps in spirit. It contained notes from conversations over the years, small observations she had made during the long hours behind the post office counter, patterns of behaviour, petty grievances, overlooked wisdom, the kinds of things no one thought she noticed. But she had, and now those pages would be her compass. At precisely 8:30 she stepped into the square, her boots striking the ground with the rhythm of someone unafraid of noise. The wind tugged at her hem and sent dry leaves skittering ahead of her like scouts. People noticed. They always did. But this time they didn't just look. They followed. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, a small crowd had formed behind her, not marching, not demanding, just following out of instinct more than intent. She didn't turn to acknowledge them. She simply mounted the steps, met Judge Broom at the top, and accepted the key he extended without ceremony. He offered her no smile, only a nod, and she returned it in kind. Then she stepped into the courthouse, and for the first time in Deadbell's long and lopsided history, it belonged to someone who had never once asked to be part of it. Inside, she took her time. She walked the length of the room. She ran her fingers over the old desk, traced the outline of a forgotten ink stain, and opened the ledgers left behind. She didn't sit in the judge's chair. She had no intention of ruling. Her job was to manage, to mediate, to steer the town through the swamp of itself without sinking. But she would need to know where the old tracks lay buried before she could lay down new ones. She flipped through the names in the books. There were too many of them, some scrawled in drunken loops, others neatly printed by nervous clerks. Each name came with a weight. Each one told a story, whispered an allegiance, hinted at a debt still unpaid. She found Pickett's name more than once, of course. Broom had kept his notes tidy where it mattered. The sheriff had traded favours like poker chips. A land dispute here, a fine waved there, a quiet deal involving mining rights and an unrecorded barn fire. Nothing that screamed corruption, just a pattern of leverage, leaned on until it creaked. She made a note in her own book, just a line. No names yet, just a pattern, just a warning. By the time she stepped back outside, the wind had died down a little. The sun was warmer, the town a bit less tense. She walked back through the square, nodded to the blacksmith, to Miss Eliza at the general store, to Horace Featherling, who stood now beside a wagon filled with books he'd taken to selling door to door. She offered no speeches, just quiet presence, and somehow that did more to settle the town than all the banners and ballots combined. Old deals had ruled Deadbell for years, stitched together with convenience and dust. But the air was shifting now, not fast, not loud. Just enough to suggest that perhaps, at long last, the town had begun to expect something more than survival. The mayor's office had never been a grand place. It sat toward the back of the courthouse, wedged between the old records room and a closet that smelled like damp wool and mice. There was no plaque, no special fixtures, no high-backed chair with stitched arms and carved finials, just a desk slightly warped from one too many summers without proper ventilation, and a window that faced a brick wall offering nothing in the way of scenery. Sheriff Pickett had never spent much time there. Most of his work was done out in the open, in the saloon or on his rounds, where visibility did more for authority than any law book ever could. But now the office belonged to Adeline, and that meant the room would no longer be a resting place for dust and unfinished paperwork. It would become something else entirely. On her second morning, she sat at the desk without hesitation. She placed her notebook down first, then a cup of tea on a small square of cloth she unfolded from her coat pocket. She took out a pen, tested the ink on a scrap, and began writing not with urgency, but with deliberate grace, as if each word needed to land in exactly the right place. There were no assistants, no clerks, no one hovering to offer suggestions or interruptions. She preferred it that way. The silence helped her think, and Deadbell, for the first time in many years, was listening. Outside, the townsfolk had resumed their routines, but something about their steps had changed. It wasn't that people were walking faster or slower. It was the way they looked around, a new kind of awareness settling over them. The gossip hadn't stopped. That would be asking too much. But it had softened, become more observational than accusatory. They weren't sure what kind of leader Miss Adeline would be, but the sense that she was watching, truly watching, made people pause before acting. There was an invisible line being drawn, not with rules, but with expectations, and that was harder to avoid than any posted law. Miss Lorna noticed it first, or perhaps she was just the first to say it out loud. She stood behind the bar of the Velvet Lily, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, and said to no one in particular, "Feels like somebody's holding a lantern up to the whole town, don't it?" The few patrons at the bar didn't respond, but their silence was agreement enough. Even the piano player, usually immune to the swirl of local politics, played softer now, as if the keys had taken on a new weight. Judge Broom, still keeping his ledger close and his words closer, stopped by the mayor's office just before noon. He didn't knock. He never did. He entered quietly, closed the door behind him, and stood for a moment, studying the woman at the desk with his habitual squint. Adeline looked up but didn't smile. She offered him the chair across from her, and he took it, settling with a sigh that might have been habit or age, or perhaps both. "I trust the key still works," he said, his voice dry as always. Adeline nodded, not looking away from the note she was finishing. "It does, though the lock could use oil. I'll see to it." He paused. "You're not going to ask me for advice?" "I already did," she said. "You gave it years ago, without knowing." That silenced him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out his own ledger, and placed it gently on the edge of her desk. "I assume you'll want this." "I'll make my own," she said. "But I'd like to read yours, if you'll let me." He hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he slid the book toward her. "Don't mistake record-keeping for wisdom." "I won't," she said, "but I find both tend to keep the same company." He chuckled once, then stood. "You'll do, Miss Crow." As he left, she placed his ledger beside hers, untouched for now. She wouldn't open it until the end of the day, after the light had shifted and the courthouse was empty. That was when she would sit alone, read the fine-inked lines, and trace the tangled roots of the town's decisions. She would not tear them up, she would not name names, but she would know, and from that knowing she would begin to plant something different. Later, as evening came, she walked the square again, not with purpose, not to inspect or assert, but simply to be seen, to be present. The wind had settled again, just a soft breeze moving between buildings. She passed by the general store, where Miss Eliza offered a smile she didn't know she was wearing. She nodded to the children chasing each other with sticks near the trough, and to the old man who had fallen asleep on the bench, his hat slipping over his eyes. She paused near the sheriff's office. The door was open, though the room beyond was dark. Pickett was gone now. His time finished not with drama, but with a quiet fade into the edges of memory. What remained was the building, the badge still hanging behind the glass, and the question of who would next take it up. But that decision could wait. For now, the town needed stillness. It needed to breathe. As the stars began to rise, Adeline returned to her desk, lit the lamp, and opened her notebook again. Not to rewrite the town's history, but to begin the slow, steady process of turning memory into motion. By the third day of Adeline's mayoralty, the town had started to settle into a rhythm again, albeit one marked by a kind of tentative quiet. It was the quiet that follows a long storm or a drawn-out illness, when everyone has learned to speak softer and move slower, because they're not quite sure yet if it's truly over. Life in Deadbell Gulch was always a matter of balance, between law and habit, between pride and necessity, between dust and what lay underneath it. And now, with Adeline sitting steady at the helm, it was clear to anyone paying attention that the town was about to be asked to examine itself a little more closely than it ever had before. It began, of all places, with the schoolhouse well. Not the front-facing water pump the children used to fill tin cups or splash on each other in the spring heat, but the old boarded-up shaft behind the building, the one that had been sealed for decades. No one quite remembered why it had been covered to begin with. Some said it had dried up, others claimed the water had gone bad. One particularly persistent tale insisted that during a winter long ago, something or someone had fallen in and was never quite recovered. Whatever the truth was, the boards had remained untouched for years, sun-bleached and moss-streaked, ignored like an inconvenient memory. It was Miss Eliza who brought it up, not because she thought it urgent, but because she'd seen a group of boys near it the afternoon before, poking at the wood with a length of bent iron. She mentioned it casually to Adeline while delivering a small parcel of ledgers and pens to the courthouse. Just a bit of passing chatter, but it stuck. That was the thing with Adeline. She didn't weigh the importance of a story by how loud it was told, she measured it by what lay beneath. So that evening, after the square had thinned out and the breeze had cooled enough to carry the scent of mesquite and old books, she walked around the back of the schoolhouse and stood in front of the boarded well. It didn't look like much, just an old wooden cover, warped and split in places, with weeds creeping up the edges and a few rusted nails holding it awkwardly in place. But Adeline crouched low, brushed aside the loose leaves and pressed her ear to one of the gaps. At first, there was only silence, then very faintly the sound of something shifting, not an echo or a wind, but a scrape, deliberate, like something being moved or dragged across stone. She stood slowly, her hands resting on her knees, and exhaled. It could have been anything. Rats, settling wood. But it didn't feel like nothing. And in Deadbell, when something felt like more than nothing, it usually was. The next morning she returned with a crowbar, a lantern, and Judge Broom in tow. He hadn't expected to be summoned for manual labour, especially not so early, and especially not for a well everyone had long agreed not to mention. But he followed her anyway, grumbling under his breath and adjusting his collar, as if the air back there were colder than the rest of the town. Together, they pried the boards loose. The wood gave with a reluctant groan, nails protesting before snapping free like brittle teeth. Beneath the boards was a stone lip slick with moss, and a narrow shaft that descended into darkness deeper than the lantern's light could reach. Adeline lowered the lantern slowly on a length of twine. It descended without incident for the first 10 feet. Then it stopped, not because the twine ran out, but because something caught it. There was a sound then, faint and breathy. Not a voice exactly, but close, like the exhale of someone who hadn't seen light in a very long time. Judge Broom stepped back instinctively, his ledger clutched tighter beneath his arm. "What in God's name?" Adeline didn't answer. She pulled the lantern back up and peered into the shaft again. Her face was unreadable, her eyes sharp. It wasn't fear she wore, but something older than that. Recognition, maybe, or memory. By noon, the schoolhouse was quietly closed for the day, and the area behind it roped off with a series of chairs, barrels, and one particularly stubborn goat that refused to move. Adeline didn't make an announcement. She didn't send for the sheriff or what was left of his office. She simply made a few notes in her book, wrote a short letter to someone in Carson City, and resumed her day. But the story had already spread. Something was in the well. Something old. Something quiet. And whatever it was, Adeline had heard it. That night, the wind returned, softer this time, curling around the eaves and rustling the lace curtains in quiet homes. In the mayor's office, the lantern glowed late, casting shadows over pages filled with names, questions, and a drawing of the well's interior. And beneath it all, something moved, slowly, patiently, as if waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The days that followed carried a quiet unease that draped itself across Deadbell Gulch like a fog no one wanted to admit they could see. The well behind the schoolhouse, once a forgotten relic covered in dust and warped planks, had become the town's most carefully avoided landmark. No signs were posted, no official declarations made, but people steered wide around the schoolhouse path. Mothers gently redirected curious children with soft hands, and even dogs stopped short, sniffing the air with puzzled eyes before turning away with their tails stiff. The silence around it grew louder with each passing hour, not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. And what wasn't, as Adeline quietly pointed out to Judge Broom one morning, tended to be far more dangerous than what was. The lantern Adeline had lowered into the shaft had caught on something solid. That much they knew. She hadn't spoken of it publicly, hadn't even shared what she believed she heard. But she returned every evening after dusk, alone, with notebook in hand and a fresh lantern swinging by her side. She'd lower it again, a few feet deeper, each time careful not to disturb what rested at the bottom, and each time the same thing occurred. The light would fall, then pause, then the stillness would shift, barely audible, like cloth brushing against stone, or maybe stone brushing against cloth. It wasn't a rustle, It wasn't the scurry of animals or the hollow creak of air through cracks. It was a response slow and measured, as if something far below was aware of her presence and considering what to make of it. By the fourth night she brought a coil of rope. She made no announcement about her descent. She simply left a short note on her desk in the mayor's office, neatly folded beneath the small silver quill pin she always wore. It read, "If I'm not back by morning, seal it again, let it sleep." There was no drama in her handwriting, no flourish of finality, just instructions, clean and clear, in the way Adeline had always done everything that mattered. She returned to the schoolhouse as the stars climbed higher and the wind dropped low. The moon was thin, the kind that barely lights your boots in front of you, and the sky was crowded with dark branches of clouds that drifted like thoughts not yet spoken. She tied the rope to the thick beam left over from the old play structure, wedged it through a pulley she'd fixed to the side of the well, and took one last breath of the above-ground air. Then she lowered herself slowly, hand over hand, boots tapping against the damp stone as the black swallowed her by degrees. The descent was longer than she expected. The light from her lantern swayed as she dropped farther and farther, brushing against the slimy rock walls and casting flickering shadows that moved like memories. The air grew cooler, thick with a scent that was not quite mould and not quite earth, but something stranger, something older. She felt it settle into her skin, that sensation of being watched not from above but from within, as though the stone itself had eyes. And then, suddenly, her boots touched down. The floor at the bottom was uneven but solid. Her lantern revealed what looked like a natural chamber, carved by water long before any settler had named this place. There were markings along the wall, faint and worn, not letters exactly, but shapes that hinted at meaning. Circles, spirals, lines broken and then resumed again. In the centre of the space, half buried in muck and stone, was a wooden box. No bigger than a bread crate, its lid cracked slightly open, not from force but from age and carelessness. Adeline knelt beside it. She did not touch it. Instead, she listened. And in that tight, airless silence she heard it. A voice, not with words, not in the way one speaks to another, but a feeling that passed through her bones like a thought half remembered. It wasn't calling her. It wasn't asking. It was waiting. And she understood, with a clarity that chilled her blood, that whatever had been placed here had not been buried. It had been stored. She stood slowly, the lantern trembling slightly in her grip. She backed away from the box, from the markings, from the hush of things too long ignored. Then she climbed, hand over hand, rope damp and slick beneath her fingers. When she emerged, breathless and pale, the moon had slipped behind a bank of clouds and the wind had begun to rise again. She didn't speak of what she'd seen, not yet. But she returned to her desk, retrieved the silver quill pin, and rewrote her note. This time it said, "Do not speak of the well. There are things it remembers." She tucked it into her notebook and began drawing again. Not from fear, from preparation. There was something beneath the town that had been waiting longer than anyone alive could remember, and now it had been seen. In the days that followed Adeline's descent into the old schoolhouse well, Deadbell Gulch went about its business as if nothing had happened, but the stillness was too precise. The streets were quieter than they ought to have been, and the usual morning greetings were delayed by a second or two, as if each speaker were measuring the weight of their own voice before offering it to the air. The children, often the first to forget unease, avoided the back of the schoolhouse altogether. Even the dog steered wide of it, tails stiff, ears low, gazes flicking toward the shadowed spot where the boards had once rested. No one had seen Adeline enter the well, but the town had a way of knowing things it wasn't told. It was in the way her hand trembled ever so slightly when she accepted her morning tea from Miss Eliza, the way her eyes looked just past the person in front of her instead of into them. Her posture hadn't changed, her voice was steady, but the space around her had shifted, as if she carried a presence now, something heavy and quiet that whispered behind her shoulder wherever she went. No one dared ask her what she saw down there, and Adeline, wise in the way only solitude and silence can teach, offered nothing unless it was necessary. The townsfolk told themselves it was just an old well, that perhaps it had startled her, that maybe she had breathed in too much stale air. But those who had lived longest in Deadbell knew better. They remembered, not through stories, but through silences, the kind that passed across faces at dinner tables when a certain name was mentioned, the kind that settled over groups of men in the saloon when someone brought up the land behind the school, or the reason the road north had never been completed. There were stories that didn't die in Deadbell. They simply sank, and like the water once buried in that shaft, sometimes they rose again. Judge Broom arrived uninvited late one afternoon, tapping his cane once against the threshold before stepping into Adeline's office. She didn't look up at first. Her pen moved steadily over a fresh page, and the only sound was the gentle scrape of ink against paper. When she finally did lift her eyes, there was no surprise in them. She had been expecting him. "You went down," he said, settling into the chair across from her, as if preparing for an argument neither of them wanted to win. "I did," she replied, her voice low. "And what did you find?" "Enough." He sighed through his nose and removed his hat, placing it carefully on his knee. "There were rumours years ago, before I arrived, before most of us were even born, I imagine, about a time when this town grew too fast, spread too far. They said something had been disturbed, that the land began to pull things back down." Adeline's pen paused. She looked at him, not with disbelief but with recognition. "It's not just the land." "No," he agreed. "It rarely is." For a moment neither spoke. The shadows in the room shifted as the sun passed behind a cloud, stretching the light across the desk like slow fingers. Finally, Adeline spoke again. "There's a box at the bottom," she said. "Old wood, not nailed shut, just resting closed. Something inside it isn't dead." Judge Broom's brow creased, though he said nothing. "I didn't open it," she continued. "I don't think I was meant to, but it saw me." He shifted in his seat, his hand resting over the cover of the ledger he still carried everywhere. "Do you believe it's dangerous?" She considered that for a long time. "I believe it remembers, and I believe that memory has a weight, a pull. Not everyone who passes it would feel it, but those who carry too much already." She let the thought trail off. Broom nodded slowly. "Memory does more damage than bullets in a place like this." That night, Adeline walked the square again. She did not carry her notebook nor the silver quill pin. She wore her oldest coat, the one with the worn elbows and the frayed hem, and walked with her hands behind her back as if measuring the town by its silence. The people watched her from behind curtains and porch railings, saying nothing, and she offered them the same in return. Words would come later, when the right ones had found her. Just before returning to her house, she passed by the post office. She paused there, her palm resting against the doorframe, eyes closed for a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped inside, lit the lantern, and began sorting through the town's unopened letters. Among them was one addressed to no one, in an unfamiliar script, sealed with no return address. She turned it over once, twice, then set it aside. Some things, even when delivered, should not be opened too quickly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dust through the streets like old rumours. Somewhere behind the schoolhouse, a loose board creaked once, then fell still. By morning, the letter sat on Adeline's desk like a stone. It hadn't moved, of course, but there was something about the weight of its presence that made it feel heavier than paper ought to be. She touched it only once since setting it down, fingers brushing the edge of the seal like someone might touch a wound that hasn't yet begun to bleed. It was a plain envelope, old but clean. The handwriting delicate and looping, almost elegant in the way forgotten letters often are. There was no return address, no stamp, just her name written in ink so faded it looked like it had been soaked in memory rather than water. She didn't open it right away. That was the sort of thing folks in Deadbell understood without needing to explain. You don't open things when they're warm with meaning. You wait, let them cool, let them decide if they're meant to be understood or simply acknowledged. Adeline had always believed in that rhythm. So she poured herself a cup of tea, pulled open the curtains to let in the grey, hesitant morning light, and watched the square begin to breathe. The postman passed by, nodding as he always did, though his eyes lingered on the closed shutters of the schoolhouse. Miss Eliza opened the general store with her usual efficiency, sweeping the steps before unlocking the door, her apron already smudged with flour. Across the way, the saloon's front doors hung slightly ajar, and Miss Lorna's silhouette could be seen behind the glass, head tilted, one hand holding her ledger, the other nursing a cup of something stronger than coffee. These were familiar motions, the comfort of things repeating. But over it all, the weight of the well, and now the letter, stretched a stillness across the town that nothing seemed able to quite shake. When Adeline finally picked up the letter, it wasn't with the urgency. It was more like acknowledging an old acquaintance who had taken a seat beside her and simply waited long enough to be noticed. She broke the seal slowly, peeled it back with the care of someone opening a door they'd never seen before. The paper inside was thin, soft with age, and the ink had bled slightly at the edges, but the words were clear. It began without greeting. No dear or hello or even a name, just words, placed one after the other like stones leading into a forest. You've heard it too, haven't you? The voice beneath. I heard it when I was a child. I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't meant to be near that place, but I wandered. They didn't believe me when I spoke of it, so I stopped speaking. That's the trick of it. It chooses who hears, but never says why. And once it finds you, it watches. Adeline's hand stilled over the letter. She read the next part twice, lips barely moving, as if afraid her voice might give something away, even in silence. It doesn't need worship, it doesn't crave blood, it waits, it listens, and when the town begins to forget itself, it reminds, not with thunder, not with death, but with little things, dreams, sounds, faces in mirrors that don't quite smile right. You mustn't feed it questions, it thrives on curiosity more than fear. You will want to know more. Resist. She leaned back in her chair, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers, though her hands were steady. Outside, a cart rolled past, the sound of its wheels rough against the stones, but comforting in its ordinariness. She returned to the final lines, which had been written in smaller script, as though the writer had grown cautious even in the act of remembering. Seal it again. Seal it without ceremony, without words, just wood and silence. It cannot be unmade, but it can be forgotten. That is your duty now, forgetting, not remembering. The letter ended there. No signature. No clue as to who had written it or when. Just the faint trace of an old ink smudge where the pen had hesitated, or perhaps been pulled away. Adeline folded it slowly, once, then again, and slid it into her notebook between two blank pages. She didn't speak, didn't sigh. She just stood and walked across the room to her cabinet, pulled out a small tin box and placed the notebook inside. Then she locked it. Later that day she returned to the well, not with rope or lantern or even notebook, just herself. She stood at the edge, gazing into the dark with eyes that saw not the stone or the depth, but the memory of what it meant to look too long. Then, with hands ungloved, she replaced the boards, not with new ones. With the same splintered pieces she had once pulled away, she laid them down slowly, matching them like puzzle pieces worn by weather and time. And when the last one was in place, she stepped back. The wind did not rise, the ground did not tremble, the voice did not return. But the silence that followed was different. Not emptiness, not peace, just a pause, as if something had blinked and turned its attention elsewhere. The well, once again sealed, no longer drew eyes the way it had before. The boards across its mouth settled in like a lid pulled gently over a slumbering face, and though everyone in Deadbell noticed the change, no one dared speak of it directly. They did what the letter had instructed, though none had read it. They forgot on purpose, or tried to. They walked past the schoolhouse with a glance that lingered just a second too short to be curiosity, and a little too long to be indifference. The children returned to their games, but didn't chase their hoops beyond the fence line. Even the teachers began closing the shutters at the rear of the classroom without saying why, as if they were simply tired of the light. Adeline never mentioned the letter to anyone. She locked it away with the same quietness she gave to everything that mattered, and each time she walked by the schoolhouse on her way to the courthouse, she kept her pace steady and her eyes forward. But the weight of it had woven itself into her steps. She was not frightened, not even burdened in the usual sense, but there was a new stillness in her gaze now, a kind of listening that didn't require ears. When folks came to her office to report petty disputes or seek her judgment on matters of fencing lines and misplaced chickens, they found her just as precise as before. But her questions had shifted slightly, less about what happened, more about how it was remembered. It was Horace Featherling who noticed it first, though not in so many words. He sat on his porch as he always did, chewing a pipe tobacco without lighting it, one eye permanently narrowed like he was suspicious of the horizon. On the third morning after the well was boarded again, he watched Adeline cross the square with her usual even gait and leaned slightly toward his wife, who was stringing beans at his side. "She's walking like someone who's counting." That's all he said. But it echoed. And he wasn't wrong. Adeline had begun keeping a record not just of the town's dealings, but of its patterns. The way Miss Lorna's candles now flickered even when the windows were shut. The way Judge Broom cleared his throat before entering any room, as if announcing his arrival to something other than people. The way the dust didn't quite settle in front of the general store anymore, but instead swirled in tiny circles, faint and constant, like it had forgotten how to lie still. None of these things were large enough to name, but they added up to something. She wrote them down at night, one line at a time. Candles flicker unnaturally. Wind no longer rests near Eliza's stoop. Horace no longer spits past the porch rail. These were not official records. They were memories in progress, tracked not for fear, but for understanding, and perhaps for warning. On the fifth evening, as the light drew thin and the town's edges blurred into that soft grey that folds everything into silhouettes, Adeline stepped out onto her own porch and sat. She didn't rock, didn't sip tea. She just watched. Across the street, lights flickered in windows, but few people moved about. A stillness had crept in, not heavy or loud, but persistent. It clung to the rafters, curled around doorposts, and sat quietly on the steps beside those who chose to stay out past dusk. Not a threat. More like a guest who'd arrived without being invited and refused to leave out of politeness. And there, on porches just like hers, the watchers began to gather. Not formally, not even with awareness, but one by one people started sitting out a little longer in the evenings. Horace, Miss Eliza, one of the wheelwright boys, even the piano player from the Velvet Lily, who brought out a stool and sat in silence with his sleeves rolled and hands folded. They didn't speak across the square. They barely moved. They just watched the night take shape, as if they expected something to declare itself in the space between stars. Adeline watched with them, her eyes tracing the edges of roofs and the angles of chimneys, waiting not for anything new, but for something familiar to feel strange again. And when the wind changed course halfway through the hour, curling up from the ground instead of down from the hills, she didn't flinch. She just nodded once, quietly, to the air. That night, long after most lamps had been extinguished and the last saloon door had sighed shut, she made one more note in her book. "They are watching too," she wrote. "Not it. Us." Then she closed the notebook, blew out the lantern, and let the dark return to its place. The following evening fell slower than usual, stretching the last of the light into long, lazy streaks that clung to the tops of buildings before finally surrendering to the dark. The town of Deadbell Gulch, with its warped boardwalks and hollow-eyed windows, seemed to pause in that moment between daylight and nightfall, caught like a breath that didn't know whether to exhale or hold. Adeline lit her porch lamp a little earlier than usual, not out of fear, but to make a point. The watchers had begun to understand that the light wasn't just for seeing, It was for being seen. The quiet sitting had become habit now, with figures appearing one by one across the town's many stoops and verandas, like moths drawn not by the glow, but by something subtler that moved beneath it. There was a comfort in their stillness, even if it came without explanation. Horace chewed his pipe stem and muttered to no one. Miss Eliza rested her sewing in her lap without threading a single stitch. The piano man sat barefoot now, his shoes tucked beneath the stool, tapping one toe against the wood in time with a song only he could hear. They all faced different directions, yet somehow they were watching the same thing. Not a place, not the well, but a feeling that drifted from house to house like smoke that never found its source. Inside the mayor's office, Adeline kept her lantern burning low and the windows cracked open. The air was cooler that night, carrying scents of cedar and old rope, the kind of smells that belong to buildings where too many truths have been stored too long. She reread the letter once more, not because she doubted it, but because it helped her remember she wasn't the first. There had been others who heard the voice beneath, who saw the small changes and wrote them down without speaking them aloud. She was beginning to suspect that the town's silence had never been ignorance. It had been instruction. As the hour grew late and even the wind seemed to settle, Adeline stepped outside and lowered herself into her rocking chair, book in hand, pen still uncapped. She didn't write that night. She just rocked slowly beneath the porch lamp, her eyes scanning the soft, flickering constellation of lights across the town, each one held by someone who now understood they were not alone in their remembering. In the early blue hours before dawn, when even the roosters had the good sense to stay quiet, a soft, dragging sound began to stir at the northern edge of Deadbell. It wasn't sharp like the squeak of a wagon, or rhythmic like bootsteps on planks. It was slower, deeper, like someone pulling a heavy trunk across gravel with one hand. Adeline, already awake with a blanket over her lap and a notebook balanced against her knees, heard it before she could name it. She sat up straighter, listening without breathing. The pencil paused mid-word. Outside her window, the air was thick and unmoving, and the sound seemed to travel along the earth itself rather than through it. She rose, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and stepped outside just as the first pale thread of light cut across the sky. The square was empty, but she knew better than to trust the surface of things. The sound had stopped now, or perhaps it had only shifted, retreated into one of the narrow alleys where rainwater pooled and secrets dried slowly. The watchers hadn't stirred yet. Their porches remained empty, the chairs unoccupied, lamps cold. For a moment it felt like the town was holding its breath again, waiting for her to do something it couldn't name. She walked slowly, her boots brushing grit, head turned slightly to the north where the dragging had begun. It was near the carpenter's shed, a place half forgotten even among locals, used now only for storage and the occasional hiding place for stray cats. As she approached, she noticed a thin trail in the dirt. Not quite a track, but a disturbance that broke the even spread of pebbles. It ended abruptly near the shed steps. No door was open, no window lifted, but something in the air felt disturbed, as though someone had just stepped away a second too late. Adeline stood there for several minutes, not moving, not thinking, just letting the morning settle around her. Then slowly she bent down and ran her fingers through the gravel. A single piece of thread lay caught between the stones, dark red, almost brown, like the edge of a memory. She pocketed it without a word and walked back through the square, the first birds now beginning to call behind her. By the time the sun climbed high enough to dry the dew off the porch rails, Adeline was already back at her desk, the bit of thread laid flat across an open page in her notebook. It wasn't the colour that unsettled her. Blood, rust, dried dye, it could have been any of those. It was the texture. The thread was coarse, stubborn in its curl, as though it hadn't been unwound from a spool but from something far older, something that had been wrapped tight for a long time. She didn't label it in her notes. She didn't even write down where she'd found it. Instead, she drew a line across the page and left the rest of the sheet blank. That silence, she felt, was more accurate. Outside, Deadbell moved with its usual laziness. The bakery opened with the clink of pans and the soft thump of kneaded dough. The clatter of hoofbeats passed by in pairs. Children skipped along the boardwalk, laughter bouncing between buildings with the same abandon it always had. And yet, beneath the routine, a shared unease buzzed faintly like a loose wire humming beneath the floorboards. Everyone could feel it now, even if no one said a word. Adeline watched it all from behind the lace curtain, one hand wrapped around her tea, the other resting on the desk as if it might reach into the notebook without needing to open it. She had not told anyone about the thread. She hadn't mentioned the dragging sound or the way the trail in the gravel had stopped too precisely, like a sentence interrupted at the moment it turned true. She wasn't protecting them from the knowledge. She was protecting the knowledge from being misunderstood. She took a slow breath and closed the notebook. Then she folded the bit of thread in a square of cloth and slipped it into the drawer where she kept her grandmother's silver buttons. A quiet place, a place things could rest. Later that afternoon, she would walk through the square again. She would greet Horace. She would ask Miss Eliza about her new shipment of fabric. She would pass by the carpenter's shed without looking at it. But in her chest, she would carry the weight of that thread, and the certainty that Deadbell was remembering something it had long agreed to forget. That evening the wind returned, not as a storm nor a breeze, but as something in between, something that carried weight without noise. It slid between buildings, stirred the curtains left half drawn, and rattled the doors that never quite shut right, as if testing how long it had been since someone checked the locks. Adeline was already walking when it began, coat buttoned to the collar, hands folded behind her back, her steps measured but not slow. The thread in the drawer still lingered in her mind, a quiet reminder that not all things left outside the house remained outside the heart. She made her way to Miss Eliza's store near twilight, under that peculiar stretch of light that makes everything appear sepia-toned and dreamlike. The windows glowed from within, and the scent of cinnamon and iron drifted from the kitchen tucked in the back. Miss Eliza was behind the counter, rolling coins between her fingers as if counting something older than currency. She looked up when Adeline entered, and her expression shifted from polite recognition to something more hesitant, like she'd been expecting someone else but wasn't entirely surprised to see her instead. "I've been meaning to ask," Eliza began, her voice lower than usual. "About the thread. The one from the shipment last spring, you remember?" Adeline stepped closer, brushing her gloved fingers along the edge of the counter. "You mean the bolt of red? Rough texture. Smelled faintly of pine and tobacco." "That's the one. I haven't sold a yard of it. Strange, isn't it? Usually those colours go quick come autumn. But folks avoided it. Even the quilting club turned it down. Did you keep any?" Eliza nodded, reaching beneath the counter and pulling out a tightly wrapped bundle. "Only a few strips left. The rest I donated to the mission church outside of Braxton, but no one ever came for it." Adeline unwrapped the cloth gently. Inside, the threads matched exactly. The colour, the twist. Even the way the ends frayed like the thread had been cut with something too dull to cleanly sever. She didn't say a word, just met Eliza's eyes with a look that held both thanks and something that felt heavier. That night, after locking the shop, Eliza swore she heard someone whispering her name through the crack of her window. But when she turned, no one was there. The town of Deadbell had grown used to its rituals. Morning sweeps along the boardwalk, noon bells at the chapel, evenings filled with quiet porch conversations and oil lamps flickering out one by one like stars falling in reverse. But on that particular night, the lamps didn't go out. Not one. From the edge of the stable to the darkened end of the Velvet Lily, each window and doorway glowed, long past the hour when sleep usually took hold. It was not planned. No word had passed between neighbours. But somehow everyone understood that night was not meant for darkness. Adeline sat in her chair by the window, watching the glow across the square with a heaviness in her chest that wasn't quite fear. It felt more like the pause before a storm, the moment when the air thickens and everything becomes too still. She hadn't mentioned the thread again to Eliza. There had been no need. The look they exchanged had said enough. Something had been stirred. Not just found, but remembered. And now the town was bracing without knowing what it was bracing for. From her window, she saw Miss Lorna stepping out with a shawl over her shoulders, lantern in hand, scanning the street not like she was expecting someone, but like she was making sure someone wasn't already there. Horace sat on his porch as usual, only this time with a rifle across his knees, though it remained untouched. It wasn't a threat, just a symbol, the way some people leave a light in the window for travellers. The piano player had set up a stool outside, though he didn't bring the instrument. He just sat there, feet bare again, tapping out a rhythm on his thigh, like he was marking time between breaths, and above them all the wind moved not in gusts, but in steady sweeping arcs, brushing over rooftops and down alleys with the hush of something listening. The well remained silent, the carpenter's shed untouched, but there was something in the way the shadows moved that suggested they were no longer alone in their keeping. When midnight came and the lamp still burned, Adeline finally rose. She didn't say a word. She simply lit a second lantern and placed it on the steps of her porch, letting its glow spill into the street like an answer to a question no one had dared to ask. Just before the sun began its slow climb over the hills, casting a sleepy gold across Deadbell's rooftops, a visitor arrived. He came not by horse or wagon, nor on foot like someone looking for work or shelter. He simply appeared at the far end of the square, standing where the road vanished into the dry gulch, and the last of the sagebrush grew brittle from waiting. He wore a long, worn coat the colour of earth after rain, and a hat pulled low so that only the line of his mouth caught the light. There was nothing peculiar about his presence at first glance. Many had passed through Deadbell over the years, seeking fortune or forgetting, often both. But this man did not move. He stood in the road like someone listening for a signal beneath the noise of the world. Adeline spotted him from her porch before the rest of the town had stirred. She watched as he lifted one hand slowly, not to wave or call out, but as if reaching towards something that wasn't quite visible. Then, without turning his head, he began walking straight across the square, boots silent against the earth, his path drawn not by familiarity but by memory. She rose without hurry, smoothing her skirt, collecting her notebook from the table where it had spent the night unopened. She met him near the edge of the fountain, where the wind caught the hem of her coat and stirred dust around their feet. He tipped his hat, not in greeting, but in recognition, as though he had expected her to be standing there all along. "You've kept the lights on," he said, his voice soft and dry, like a library no one visited any more. Adeline nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "And you've come to see why." He smiled then, a slight crooked smile that held neither kindness nor threat, just the weary patience of someone who travelled too far to pretend surprise. "It doesn't like being remembered." Adeline glanced toward the schoolhouse, where the boards still held fast and the ground beneath them remained unmoved. "I don't believe it likes being forgotten either." The man said nothing to that. He simply looked past her, toward the certain spot where the gravel once bore a trail that vanished too soon. His silence said what words could not. He wasn't here to speak. He was here to witness. The man didn't ask for a room at the inn, nor did he seek food or water. He didn't inquire about the sheriff or the preacher or the state of the crops. Instead, he moved through Deadbell like someone retracing old steps, glancing down alleys and pausing in doorways as though waiting to hear voices that had long since faded. Adeline walked a few paces behind him, not following exactly, but staying near, the way one walks beside a memory they don't yet understand. The town stirred slowly as it always did. Children emerged from doorways with their satchels, chickens scattered beneath porches, and the first curl of chimney smoke unfurled into the sky. But there was a hush to it all, restrained motion, like even the dogs had agreed it was not a day for barking. He stopped at the corner near Eliza's shop, where the lamplight from the night before still clung faintly to the glass, as if reluctant to let go. He turned to Adeline then, his eyes darker now, or maybe the light simply failed to catch them fully. "I came through here once," he said, and his voice held the cadence of someone unused to speaking aloud. "Long time ago, place wasn't so quiet." Adeline nodded, arms crossed lightly. "We have had to learn silence." His gaze drifted toward the well, though he did not walk that way. That's not something people learn easily. It takes generations. She studied him a moment. There was something about the lines in his face that felt familiar, not in the way of recognition, but in the way that old furniture carries the shape of those who once leaned on it. "You wrote the letter." He didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped away from the shop's shadow and let the sunlight land on his shoulders. His coat was frayed along the hem. The stitching around the cuffs looked hand-done, uneven. "I tried to forget," he said quietly. "Left this place before my voice even broke, but forgetting only works if the place forgets you too." Adeline glanced toward her office, where her notebook still rested inside the drawer, pages full of things the town had stopped saying aloud. "It hasn't forgotten. Not you. Not what it's been keeping." His jaw twitched slightly. "Then it's awake." She didn't answer because she didn't need to. Instead, she motioned toward the bench beneath the mayor's porch, the one worn smooth by decades of waiting. He sat slower than expected, as though the dust beneath his boots remembered him, and wanted to hold him still for a moment longer. The silence between them stretched again, not uncomfortable, but full, not emptiness, expectancy. That afternoon, the visitor did not leave the bench. He remained there, still as a scarecrow, hands clasped, hat low, eyes shifting only now and then as the town passed in slow motion around him. Children walked by quieter than usual, eyes darting towards the stranger without asking questions. Even Horace, gruff as a broken fence post, simply nodded once as he passed with a bag of feed and didn't utter a word. Adeline watched all of it from her office window, the pages of her notebook untouched for once. There are moments in a town's life when nothing should be written down. Moments when the air itself seems to carry meaning, when setting it to ink might strip it of something vital. Just after the bell from the chapel struck 4, she rose and opened the small door beneath the stairs. It creaked like it always had, and a gust of stale, boxed-in air rolled out thick with the scent of old paper, dry cloth and wood that had kept its secrets. The shelves inside were cluttered with boxes tied in twine and tins of ink long hardened. Near the back, under a faded quilt square, and an old tin marked buttons, she pulled out the roll she had hidden there years ago. It was older than her tenure, older than the courthouse itself, scrawled across paper browned by time and etched in a hand steadier and more exact than most had reason to use. A map, but not of the town as it stood. It showed something deeper, less fixed. Buildings that no longer existed. Pathways that twisted beneath the ones visible now. Annotations in the margins spoke of foundations with no doors, stones found too smooth, and marks on floorboards where no tools had passed. She spread it on the table and called to the man outside. He stepped in without hesitation, though he paused in the doorway like someone crossing into a room he'd sworn never to re-enter. When he saw the map, something in his shoulders settled. Not relief exactly, but recognition. "I remember this," he said, fingers brushing the lower corner, where the ink had bled through. "It was buried in the church cellar. My grandfather said it was drawn the year the well was sealed the first time." Adeline pointed to a small mark near the old carpenter's shed. "You left this symbol in your letter?" He nodded. "That's where it first spoke to me." Neither of them moved for a long time. The sun began to dip, casting shadows that crawled slowly across the map like hands searching for memory. And still, no one outside spoke of what was coming. But in that quiet room, 2 people finally understood the shape of what the town had built itself upon. As evening settled in for its slow descent, casting the town in a syrupy light that draped across rooftops and sank into alley corners, Adeline lit the second lantern in her office and slid the map across the table to the visitor. He rolled up his sleeves carefully, revealing forearms lined with pale scars, the kind that spoke of childhood mischief or forgotten labour. His hands were steady, but the way his fingers hovered above the parchment betrayed something older than fear. It was memory he carried there, not just his own, but that kind of inherited knowing passed down in huffed whispers and unfinished stories. He touched the symbol again, the crooked mark beside the carpenter's shed that looked like a broken eye, and for the first time that day he spoke with a thread of weariness in his voice. "My brother went missing the night that was carved," he said. "They said he wandered, that he probably ran, like boys do when they're angnebgri and believe the road will listen. But I heard him. For 3 nights. I sat on the floor of our house with my ear to the boards. I could hear him scratching." Adeline remained still, her breath soft and quiet in the room's small echo. She glanced toward the floor without meaning to, then returned her gaze to the man. "Did you ever tell anyone?" He shook his head, more out of shame than secrecy. "I was 10. No one believed in ghosts, not in daylight. And by the time I found the courage to say anything, my mother had stopped asking questions. She looked right through the walls like the answers were hiding in the wallpaper." They sat in silence, the map between them, the room filled with the slow ticking of a clock. Neither of them had wound in months. Adeline leaned forward and gently pressed her finger to the other end of the path near the church's cellar. "If the sound moved, it moved in circles," she said, "not in lines. The marks here, the ones faded into the floorboards beneath the pews, they aren't scratches. They're drawn, repeated." The visitor nodded slowly. "It waits for someone to hear." Adeline stood and crossed the room to her shelves, pulling out an old carpenter's mallet, one left behind by a former mayor who fancied himself a builder in his off hours. She held it in her palm like a question, weighing its purpose. "Then maybe it's time we listened. Properly, but on our terms." The visitor met her eyes and said nothing, but the map still open between them said enough. Whatever had been buried had not been forgotten, and now it seemed it no longer wished to remain still beneath their feet. They waited until after the lamps had been lit in every window across Deadbell, and the quiet had settled deep, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough. The town slept uneasy now, not in fear exactly, but in anticipation, the way a body lies still before the thunder rolls. Adeline locked the front door of the office with the map tucked beneath her coat and the mallet wrapped in canvas under one arm. The visitor waited beside the steps, watching the shadows lean long across the square like fingers reaching from some forgotten place beneath the earth. They said nothing as they walked, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that always rose near the edge of the carpenter's shed. It was not often used anymore. The roof sagged where it met the chimney and the windows, though intact, had long lost their shine. Yet the structure had held firm, as though its purpose had simply gone dormant rather than disappeared. Adeline ran her hand along the doorframe before pushing it open. The hinges groaned softly, not in protest, but as though remembering the weight of secrets. Inside, the air was dry and old, thick with the scent of cedar and forgotten tools. Shafts of lamplight cut through cracks in the slats, revealing dust motes that swirled slowly as if stirred by breath alone. The floorboards creaked beneath their steps, and the centre of the room gave slightly with each movement. It wasn't a loose board or rot, it was something deeper, a kind of flex, like the earth itself held its breath beneath them. Adeline knelt and laid the map flat, aligning its markings to the cracks in the floor. The visitor crouched beside her and tapped gently along the boards, pausing when he reached one that gave less than the others, as though it had been nailed not to keep it in place, but to keep something below from rising. She handed him the mallet without speaking. He took it and removed the nails one by one, carefully, reverently, as though afraid the act itself might be overheard. With each pull, the room seemed to hold tighter to its silence, until finally the board lifted free with a breathless pop. Beneath it, darkness waited. Not the kind of dark that comes with night, but the dense, humming dark of something that remembers being buried. They stood over it for a long moment, neither moving, neither blinking. The hole yawned up at them, silent but alive, and the air that rose from it was cool and dry and full of something that felt very close to listening. The first breath that rose from beneath the floor was not like air. It carried no scent, no chill, no warning. It moved softly, brushing past their skin like the memory of something warm that had long since gone cold. Adeline stared down into the exposed hollow, her eyes adjusting slowly to the absence of light. The space below was not a tunnel nor a simple void. It was shaped just enough that one could tell it had not formed naturally. Walls smoothed by hands or time curved inward, as if designed to hold something or someone very still. And at the centre, faint but visible in the gloom, a wooden box lay undisturbed, its surface worn, its corners pressed tight against the earth as if the soil itself had sealed it there. The visitor knelt at the edge, one hand braced on the floorboard, the other gripping the frame of the hole. He did not lean closer. He did not reach down. Instead, he bowed his head like someone listening through wood, as if waiting for the box to whisper back. Adeline said nothing. She could feel the pull now, not physical, but unmistakable. A gentle urging that stirred something behind her ribs, something curious and old, the same tug she had felt the night she stood at the edge of the well, a call to remember. But it was more than memory. It was suggestion, it was invitation. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coat as she fought the small, irrational desire to lower herself through the gap and press her hand against the box's lid just to feel if it was warm. She looked at the man beside her and saw the same conflict flicker across his face. He had been here before, not in this exact spot, but near enough in spirit. The lines at his mouth had grown deeper since the last board was lifted, his breath slower. He was remembering something that never fully belonged to him, and it was speaking again. "We can't open it," Adeline said at last, her voice steady but hushed. "No," he replied, eyes still fixed below. "It doesn't want to be opened. It wants to be known." The box did not move. The shadows in the hollow did not shift, but the silence around it changed, thickening like smoke. Something beneath them understood that it had been seen again, and it no longer needed to call out. It only needed to wait. Adeline reached down and pulled the board back over the hole, pressing it firm against the edges until it sat flush. The visitor stood slowly, as if rising through a heavy dream. They did not speak again. They walked out of the shed with the door left slightly ajar behind them, the air now charged with the knowledge that something had listened, and would remember. The next morning came slow and without colour. The light that usually crept across Deadbell's rooftops arrived grey and tired, brushing the chimneys without enthusiasm, and casting soft, directionless shadows that made the town look slightly less real. Adeline stepped out onto her porch with the same quiet routine she always kept, but something in her felt changed. Like a note held too long had begun to tremble. Across the square, windows opened and closed in silence. No greetings were exchanged, no laughter from the children playing marbles near the fountain. Even the dogs barked with restraint, their usual gusto replaced with brief, uncertain yaps that faded quickly into the stillness. The visitor hadn't left town, but he was no longer walking its edges or watching from the bench. He had taken a room at the edge of the livery barn, where the boards were warped and the ceiling low, and he spent most of the morning sitting at the small writing table inside, head bowed, fingers motionless. He did not write. He only sat, as though whatever words he'd once carried had been spent at the mouth of the hollow, beneath the carpenter's shed. Adeline passed by the barn on her way to the courthouse and paused, seeing the edge of his shadow through the cracked shutter. She didn't call out or knock. She only stood there for a moment, her gaze soft and still, before moving on with the same care one might give a dream that hadn't quite settled into memory. The map lay unrolled on her desk once more, pinned at each corner with smooth stones gathered from the creek bed west of town. She studied it longer this time, not looking for markings, but for what wasn't drawn, for the spaces between structures, the gaps between annotations, the quiet places that townsfolk passed every day without thought. Her eyes landed on the old jailhouse, long since closed after the last sheriff rode north and never returned. It hadn't been used in nearly a decade, but the building still stood, squat and stubborn at the edge of the town's second square. The map showed a mark there too, faint and almost rubbed out. Not a symbol this time, but a line, curved and repeating, like a ripple drawn by someone who had seen it once in water and tried to capture it in ink. She left the office before noon and walked the narrow road that wound behind the tailor's shop and up toward the jailhouse. The doors groaned open with effort, their hinges reluctant, and the interior smelled of ash and rainwater trapped too long in wood. The cells were empty, rust blooming at the corners, and the ceiling sagged in places where time had pressed, down harder than gravity ever could. But there in the floor, just beyond the iron bars of the first cell, was a patch of stone unlike the rest. Its colour was deeper, the brick smooth not by wear but by contact, as if someone or something had leaned there often, for long stretches of time. She knelt slowly, fingers grazing the surface, and then she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more the space where sound used to be. An absence shaped like a whisper. It pressed into her chest rather than her ears, like memory speaking through bone. She did not flinch, did not draw back. She only placed her hand flat against the stone and waited. After a moment her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. It was the same presence from the carpenter's shed, not speaking, not reaching, just watching from within. When she stood again, she noticed a faint groove near the base of the wall, hidden in the shadows of the cell's far corner. The curve of it matched the one on the map, not random, not erosion, deliberate. She stepped back through the cell door, letting it close behind her with a soft click, and walked to the front of the building without looking back. By late afternoon she had spoken to Horace, to Eliza, and to Lorna, not in secrets, not in whispers. She told them plainly, with steady voice and open hands, that the town had remembered something it was never supposed to forget, that something beneath their streets and porches and foundations had stirred, not because it was angry, but because it had been named. Again, not with malice, with memory. That night, when the porch lights flickered on and the watchers resumed their quiet vigils, Adeline placed her notebook on the courthouse steps, open to a blank page, and beside it she left a pencil, not for herself, for anyone who heard the echoes and chose at last to speak. The notebook stayed untouched until the middle of the night. The wind had gone quiet by then, and the creak of the courthouse sign above the steps had settled into silence. Lamplight flickered from only a handful of porches. Most had burned out early, whether from fatigue or quiet surrender. Adeline sat at her window still, a single candle burning at her side, its wax pooling slowly in a metal dish shaped like a sunflower. She was not waiting for anything in particular, only breathing in the kind of silence that makes it easier to hear the thoughts that don't yet have words. Somewhere near 2 a.m. she rose and stepped outside. Her boots met the boards of the porch with a soft creak, and the night opened around her like a book that had been waiting patiently to be read. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of cool that keeps a person awake without urging them back inside. She crossed the square without sound, the loose gravel beneath her soles shifting just enough to remind her she was real. When she reached the steps of the courthouse, she paused. The notebook was still there, right where she had left it, and the pencil lay across the page like a bridge between thoughts. But someone had written something. It wasn't in her handwriting. It wasn't even in a style she recognised. The letters were long, curled slightly at their ends, as though they had been written slowly by someone unused to the act of writing, or perhaps someone remembering how to do it after a long time. The ink was faint, almost dust-coloured, but legible under the moonlight. It read, "They watched me sleep, but I was never sleeping." Adeline stared at the line for a long time. Her heart didn't race, her breath didn't hitch, but something beneath her ribs stirred like a rope being pulled gently from a well. She turned the page, half expecting more, but the sheet beyond was blank. And yet she knew there would be more, not tonight, but soon. She picked up the notebook and held it close as she stepped back into the quiet of the mayor's office. She did not light another candle. She simply placed the book on her desk and sat beside it, eyes closed, listening to the way the wood of the room settled around her. The wind began again just before dawn. A slow, circling wind that moved without direction, like something unsure of where it wanted to go. It passed through Deadbell without waking anyone. By morning, news had drifted through the square that Horace had heard singing near the well. Not loud, not clear, but a low hum that twisted beneath the earth. He hadn't gotten out of his chair to investigate, just sat there, pipe in hand, staring at the horizon with the expression of a man who finally saw the shape of a question he'd spent his whole life trying not to ask. Miss Eliza, too, found something that morning. A strip of that same red thread wound around the base of her porch lantern, tied in a knot so neat it could not have been the wind, nor her own hands in some forgotten moment. She didn't untie it. She left it hanging, like a ribbon from a ceremony that no one remembered hosting. As for the visitor, he was gone by sunrise. His room empty, the bed undisturbed. But in place of a goodbye, he had left his coat folded neatly on the porch rail of the carpenter's shed. And in the pocket, tucked where it could not be seen but easily found, was a note in the same handwriting as the message in the notebook. Only 3 words. Keep the story. Adeline read it twice before placing it beneath the cover of her own journal. She sat for a long while at her desk, not writing, not speaking, just letting the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders like a shawl passed down through generations. Outside, the town moved slowly back into its rhythm. Children played, bread baked, hammers clinked in rhythm. But something had changed. Not broken, not repaired, shifted. Deadbell had remembered. Not the facts or the events or even the names, but the shape of the story it had tried so long to forget. And in that remembering it had started to breathe again. That final evening came gently, as if the sky itself understood that no more questions needed answering. The light folded itself around the edges of buildings, slipping through window panes and brushing over rooftops like an old friend saying goodbye without the need for words. Adeline sat on the steps of the mayor's office, the notebook resting close beside her, no longer clutched, no longer guarded. It had become part of the town now, a living thing. It belonged to whoever needed it next. The wind was soft and warm, weaving slowly through the square like a lullaby, hummed by a grandmother, with no one left to sing to. No strange sounds stirred beneath the floorboards. No threads appeared on doorsteps. No figures watched from the shadows. Deadbell had settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of forgetting, but the hush of a story finally told. The watchers still sat on their porches, but their faces had changed. Lighter in some way. Not free of worry, but clearer in purpose. They no longer waited for the unknown. They watched with it, beside it, understanding that whatever had been buried had never meant harm. It had only asked not to be erased. Miss Eliza hung new curtains in her shop, and in the corner of the window the red thread still dangled like a bookmark in a chapter she now chose to remember. Horace had begun greeting neighbours again, even offering a nod to passing wagons with a look that said he was ready to hear whatever stories rolled their way. The piano man played once more, his melody slower now, fuller. It didn't fill the whole street, but it didn't need to. It simply wrapped around the corners like a blanket left out on a cool night. And Adeline, still mayor of a town that whispered instead of shouted, took each morning as it came. Some days she wrote, some days she read, some days she simply sat and listened, not for echoes but for stillness, the kind that settles when a town knows itself again. She knew, of course, that new questions would rise, that new stories would form, but the weight of forgetting was no longer hers to carry alone. Deadbell had remembered, and in that remembering it had made peace not just with its past, but with the rhythm of its own breath. And so the story rested, not closed, not ended, just resting softly.